Hi there, Atul, your host again. So, welcome to another Math Chat Live. This is all about interaction between you and our lovely panelists. So, do a quick round of introductions. So, I'm Atul. I teach maths and science online, and I'm based in London. So, over to you, Pete.
I'm Pete. I run a maths department in Leicestershire, and I also work for the East Midlands South Maths Hub as their secondary mastery lead.
Okay, hi, I'm Deb. I live in Brighton, work in Worthing at Durrington Research School. I started a new job there last September, so I've sort of had 6 months and then it all went a bit weird. I am also a Maths Hub secondary lead for Sussex Maths Hub.
Brilliant, and we'll be joined by Ashton soon as well, hopefully, fingers crossed. Just to this is our open-ended conversation, so we're using the hashtag MathsChatLive. So if you've got any questions you'd like to ask us, just put it out there on Twitter and we can discuss. I've started tutoring already. I've started teaching maths already this time of the year, and one thing that came up for TT today was a year 10 one, and they're kind of wondering between whether they'll be in foundation or higher, and for me it was always like, well, let's not worry about that yet, let's just learn the maths, and then that decision will come when the time comes. Let's learn as much as possible. But again, they said something that's can be quite typical of what TTs say, is that well, I'm just learning this for the sake of learning it and passing the maths exam. I won't really use these things in real life much later on. So at that moment, exact reaction I had, Pete. Like, oh no.
No, sad.
Yes. So yeah, and that's quite a common one for students who are not sure and it's kind of low attaining, and so it's just sort of an open-ended discussion on how do we motivate students with that kind of statement, or just get them to see, even as late as year, I say late, but I say if their exam is prominent and they're in year 11 halfway through it on a foundation, and just to see what they're doing to be beyond just what the exam asks for, because we understand what it is to be a mathematician, but how do we convey that, what it means to be a mathematician and what they will do beyond there.
That's a tough opener.
Yeah.
Debs and I are going to look at you stunned here, I think. What do we say? I mean, the obvious thing for me is the earlier you get them, the better.
Yeah.
So if you've got to year 10 and you've still got that attitude, it's more of a battle to tackle that than if you're approaching it in year 7 and things like that. I mean, in year 7, I talk to kids a lot about the things they're learning, having longevity, the history of them, trying to make it feel connected to not necessarily to their everyday lives, because it often isn't, but connected to human discovery and human learning, and this wider idea of a big part of the human experience is bettering ourselves and learning about things and making and finding out things that we rarely come across in our everyday work experience. In fact, that's for me a big part. That if we just left you on your own, you wouldn't learn. If we just left you with your families, or we just sent you out to work at 12, these are the things you wouldn't be exposed to. That's a good thing. But obviously that argument gets a hell of a lot harder to pull the higher up they get, when their sort of main focus, as we might say, is on the the qualification on the exam. And that's because obviously the amount of currency that we've given it in this country, both in terms of schools and in terms of what opportunities are open for students if they get it and if they don't. So I would still want to, I'd still be saying the same sort of things, but I can see they would have less impact lower up, the further up the school you would go.
I think I was thinking about this the other day, actually, because one of the things that, in a way, this current COVID crisis has really brought home is the amount of maths and science there is in the media at the moment, and in that people need to understand, and lots of people don't. And even the small bit we do at school can help, I think, help them to understand what's going on with the R number and what have you, and actually maybe that will be a good thing when we go back and to try and explain to some of the older kids, you do need to know what's going on. You need to understand the news. You need to be critical with what the government's telling you or not telling you, or what all these scientists are saying, and have a bit of understanding. So maybe that will work in our favour, because it's become such a big deal.
Yeah, certainly there's been a...
Maybe, and we've been joined.
Yeah. Hi, Ashton. Welcome to the call.
Sorry I'm late.
That's all right.
Never though.
I threw in a very tough opener for the panel.
It sounded like yeah, maybe it's a good job I was late.
No, it's basically, to sum it up, it's like, oh sir, why are we doing this in maths? When will we ever need this in real life, kind of thing. And how to, particularly like given the circumstances and everything that's happened. But it was just that question. So yeah, I mean, it could be that comes up for someone in year 9. For me, it came up today with someone in year 10. And so the question was, how would you, what's your response to that, to your particular student in that moment? How would you hope that they think more like a mathematician beyond the GCSE exam that's coming up? That's like something like that.
Yeah.
And you have to answer that now, Ashton, not having had the benefit of hearing mine and Dennis.
Oh God. No, I mean, it's always a tough question, and I think that when a kid asks me that, I'm like, most of the time my alarm bells are kind of going like, oh no, they're not really understanding this. I haven't explained it well enough, and that's always like the first thing that runs across my mind, because. Okay, so sometimes you'll get a kid that's like smashing it, flying through it, and is genuinely interested and is like, oh, this is really cool. Like, what kind of the uses of this? But most of the time it's like they're struggling and they kind of don't see the point in it. And I think with maths, it's often, a lot of kids are told that, maths is important and you need to get your maths. And obviously there's the government even say that themselves by making kids get a 4 or above. And when pupils are struggling, they're looking for, why is this particular bit of maths useful? Why do I have to know this if it's so difficult? Yeah. So usually I'll have a couple of different answers, and it's either, if I know something about the background of it, I'll start explaining it. And usually they're like, oh, okay, that's quite interesting. But I don't know that for everything, and sometimes I'll say, have a go, like I'll try and give them support, and like it's actually quite interesting and enjoyable once you get good at it. It's just tricky at first, and try and build up the confidence that way, and say, we're not gonna, not everyone needs to know this, but the more you know, the more options you have in life. You might never know this, but just in case, let's nail this together, kind of thing.
I think you're right. You've got like almost 2 different angles, aren't there? There's the specific and the general. And in the general sense, I like to tell, especially it's easy with younger kids, maths is all about patterns. It's all about beauty and making connections and logic, and being able to think logically is really, really important for whatever you do, because you might not need to specifically solve this specific equation. However, the processes you are going through to work through logically and being able to apply something in an abstract form, go from the concrete to the abstract is a really important skill that transferring is another thing, but it does help you to develop that. But then you're right, sometimes it's really useful to be able to go, well, sine and cosine and the sine curve is all to do with sound waves or whatever, and it's about this closing doors and opening doors. I'm not here to decide whether you might want to go and work in a engineering field or whatever, and I don't want to close the doors to you now by saying it's not worth you learning.
Yeah No, I think exactly.
I think it was a good point you made, Ashton, about oftentimes that is a cover for I can't do this.
Yeah.
And actually recognizing that and treating that for what it is. Say, okay, well, there are uses for it. I can tell you where the uses are. You may actually not use it much in real life, things like that. But I tell you what, before we worry about how you're going to use it, let's worry about getting good at it, because that's really what you're telling me your issue is. Actually, you're feeling like you're going to struggle to do this. You are struggling with it. You're going to struggle to get good at it. You don't want to, if there's a way you can opt out of that struggle by dismissing it because it's useless or whatever else, then actually that's the easier path. That's the path of least resistance. So let's head them off that path and say, it might be difficult. You might not see much value in it now. Let's spend some time together trying to get good at it and trying to see, where your difficulties are and things like that. And who knows, if you figure out some of these things, then maybe your attitude towards it might change, and you might start to see places where actually you can use it and that it's good to have and stuff like that. But let's just concentrate on getting good at it first.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. I mean, I remember Ed Southall brought this up on a thread on Twitter as well, and he said something like, I don't get it equals I reject the thing. So often that's just a cover for I just didn't get this thing, or I didn't get that, or I didn't get this and this, and like the whole thing has become, what's the point of it all? So and often it is obviously just acknowledging that they are stuck, and then just making them good at it. And the more they get good at things, at the different parts of maths. The thing with maths is it's such a massive web of ideas. Having looked at Mark McCourt's like mathematical universe, that it's, for us as experts, we know what everything is linked up and what the whole big picture looks like, but it's hard for them to see that. But once they can link up a few things together and see how it works, as Deb said, that in the media we have the whole R value, which is exponentiation, right? It's just exponentiation, the idea is there, and how the media also uses maths and statistics as well to mislead or make their point, etc. And somewhere at some point they would have learned something, and then it might twig, and then they can see actually this thing does make sense, that thing that they were saying in the maths class about exponential powers and things like that. So
fully enough, my first lesson back with year 11 next week is about, the first part of the unit is around growth and decay. So guess what I'll be using to work with that and to play with that. Absolutely. Yeah, what does an R number of 1 actually mean? What does an R number of more than 1? But I think what's interesting from what you've said there, Atul, is, when they get to see those connections and start to build that idea and start to be able to sort of make those connections, that for me really talks to how we then teach and how we support learning in a way that's going to foster that, in a way that's going to allow students to see that. And that's what worries me sometimes about some of the things that come out in maths education, in terms of really taking certain isolated things and sort of drilling those. I'm not necessarily not a fan of drill, because drill has its place and it has its purpose, but drilling those in isolation of any other part of a big picture. When do kids get to see that big picture? That's what I would want. That's what I want to know about when I talk to teachers like that who are doing those sorts of things and who are advocating these approaches. When do kids get to see that big picture? When do kids get to see how it all fits together? When do kids get to see that, the addition that they do when they add fractions is no different to the addition that they do when they add surds or when they add like terms or this or that? When do they get to see that? And I think, if we accept the premise, and some people won't, but if we accept the premise that a student's abilities to make those connections within those areas of mathematics is a motivating factor for it, and a motivating factor to learn it and to be successful in it, then do we make sure that our teaching is there to support that? Don't know if there's a question in that, or if it's just an observation or a statement, but yeah.
No, definitely. I mean, it's part of curriculum design as well, or the choice of questions. I've been thinking about it quite deeply recently. Is that we seem to have in maths quite a lot of things that come in twos. So if you're adding fractions with different denominators, you have a half plus a third, and that can mean that you can do these shortcuts, and nix the tricks like the butterfly method, etc. But why not three? Why not a half plus a third plus a fifth, and then more, and then generalize? In which case you can't use any of those shortcuts, or the FOIL stuff, right? You got the two brackets, or one term and a bracket, but why not three? Why not four? Why not five? Because that's what we really want them to. So often the very questions, if you kind of work backwards, if you look at the exam paper, well, most of the time they're being asked on a foundation paper to add two fractions with different denominators. You can get away with the butterfly method, or most of the time you're asking a FOIL-like expression. You can get away with FOIL. So it's part as well. It's the design of what's coming up at the end.
Which I think is getting better now.
Yeah.
I mean, foundation paper, there's still going to be 50%, some of it hidden away, of standard approaches, and standard approaches are, fairly standard, but they can hide those things and they can throw some curveballs. I think the assessment's starting to do the right thing in terms of prompting teachers to teach mathematics rather than teach procedures. So we'll see how that plays out over the coming years. We'll see what changes are necessary in 2021, of course, as well, to what they're going to assess. Those have been some fun discussions in school the last couple of days. How are you going to be changing your curriculum for these sort of things? Can you not strip out all of this? It's like, no, actually, really can't. That's quite integral to students being able to connect these things and and go on that journey through this idea. So it's going to be an interesting way to see how the exams in 2021 reflect the situation, I think.
I was thinking it's ironic that moving averages went out of the GCSE a couple of years ago, didn't they? Seeing as there's a moving average on the news about every day at the moment.
7-day moving averages. Who'd have thought they'd have ever been useful, eh?
Brilliant. Yeah, and I suppose that leads on to the thing that came up a little bit anyway. So schools are about to start up, and Pete, you already mentioned that's one of the first things you'll be teaching. But what comes to mind for the rest of you? Is there maybe you'd just like to get an idea of where they are, do some sort of assessment, or go into something you have already in mind?
For me, because they've covered quite a bit of content while they're away. And obviously I want to know where they've got to in that. But some things are more essential than other things. So for instance, if they've covered, volume and surface area, and they've got straight line graphs coming up, it's not essential that they understand straight line graphs to be doing volume and surface area. So I'm going to almost spread out what they've covered over a longer period of time, and try and do the more essential stuff first, because if you've come back and you've struggled with work over lockdown, and you're getting tested on 10 different topics, that's really quite overwhelming. Whereas if it's maybe 2 at a time and you kind of revisit them for a week or two, and then the next 2, obviously it depends what comes up in your scheme of work and what prior knowledge is needed, but it doesn't need to be, you don't need to rush that content, I don't think. I think it can be slower than little and often.
Yeah, I don't know really. I'm still sort of slightly at the end of holiday mode, so I haven't got fully back into looking at what I'm doing in a week and a bit. But I know, certainly we're planning with Key Stage 4 with Year 10 going into Year 11 to look back in at what they have supposedly covered in starters. And in fact, actually, I mean, my year 11 group will change from the one I've had in year 10 anyway, for various reasons. And I came into the school new last year and took on a new year 11. And in that sense, I think I was always trying to work out what they knew and what they didn't. I have to go back over stuff. And, you know, you do that anyway, especially with the class you've taken on in halfway through a course. So in my year 11 last year, I was sort of saying, well, have you are supposed to have covered this, and they go, oh no, we've never done that before, and all that sort of stuff they tell you. So in a sense, I'm not so worried, because I think we do that all the time, and there will be bits we'll need to go back over and reteach, and misconceptions we'll need to sort out, but I wouldn't want to completely change everything that we had in plan, and I want to follow it as we are expected to do.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm quite lucky in that when I joined the school 6 years ago, it was a Key Stage 3 only school. So my job was actually to build the GCSE curriculum. They never had one there before for maths. And when we wrote it, we wrote in some useful redundancy at some key points. So like the first unit I'm going into with year 11 is coming from year 10, is a unit that we titled Number Problems, and basically the actual content within that is just a revisit of a bit of percentage work, bit of proportion, inverse proportion, say growth and decay is in there, that sort of thing. But all of that is stuff that they have done in inverted commas. Now, in fact, I know there's some stuff that they haven't done in there. The last unit that they should have done in year 10, they didn't do. It wasn't even set as lockdown work. We didn't have time. But that was algebraic proportion. And that's why Number Problems is the first unit in year 11, because they do algebraic proportion at the end of year 10. And then at the beginning of year 11, part of that unit is that proportion thing that you learned right at the end of year 10. Well, here's some interesting ways in which that gets used. And so actually all I've done is, like, as part of that unit, plan to feed in some of the stuff more of the stuff from the end of year 10 than I otherwise feel like I would have had to have done, around actually understanding how proportional relationships are expressed and used algebraically, and the sort of algebraic skills that run alongside it. I'm just going to feed some of that in, and the unit will take a little bit longer, but nothing major. The ones I'm most concerned about, I must admit, are my year 8 and year 9, because our scheme at Key Stage 3 is really, really carefully planned, both not just in terms of the content. Sorry, it started raining. I'm just going to shut my window. Both in terms of the content, but also the way it's approached and the way they see things. For me, obviously, the representations that they should have seen, and that was the difficult bit for lockdown, was you couldn't do those, work with those representations and those concepts in the same way. So we know that there's a number of them coming back at the beginning of year 8, beginning of year 9, that do not have what they need in the supporting materials for some of that. So we're just going to have to work in it. We've got the starters that look back to previous years. We're going to have to look for those gaps. We know what the bits they haven't done, and we're just going to have to work to address them, while at the same time moving forward where we can move forward.
Brilliant. I think Dawn's got a comment/question, but are you planning many changes to your normal teaching planning routines for September? I think we've kind of partly addressed that, but maybe there's something else.
One of the things we've talked about a lot in the department, actually, is because the big thing is you can't get close to kids, or it's rather inadvisable to get close to kids. If you absolutely have to get within 2 meters of them, try and stay a meter away. And if you have to get within 1 meter, we've got a system in school where you've got to log that as contact automatically. So if we do have a case, it's track and traceable. And every time a teacher gets within 1 meter of a pupil, wow, in the classroom environment, or a TA or anything else, they've got to log that. And they've got to email that off, which it's horrible, but at the same time is perfectly sensible as a need to be able to figure out what the transmission vectors are. So what we've been talking about is ways that we can cope with the fact that we are not going to be able to get and so the sort of things I've been talking with the team are extending that early, what Mark would call the teach do phase. of the lesson, extending that a lot more, so that by the time they come to practice, you can pretty much guarantee that the vast majority of them are going to be successful with that practice with minimal or no input from you. Because that's the be at. You're not going to be able to go over and sit next to them and have that little conversation with them or whatever else. Also, when things I've talked to the team about, when you're actually doing the practice, even at that point, not letting them go too long before they're getting checks to confirm. If you've got standard thing, a 10-question worksheet or something like that, whereas in the past, some teachers would have just said, that do them 10 questions and then in 10 minutes, 15 minutes, we'll go through the answers or whatever else. Well, now it's in the next 2 minutes, do question 1, and if you can, do question 2, but don't go further than question 3. And then in 2 minutes' time, I'm going to put the answer to question 1 up, perhaps a model solution to question 1. You check you've done the right thing. And if you've not done the right, your hand at that point, and you always getting that chance to check back, even with, and then the kids that don't need that, they'll just plow. They get the chance to check and make sure, but you'll catch the errors then. And then the other thing we talked about is narrating back, because you can't go and look at their book necessarily. You might not be able to get close enough if they're back of the room, something like that. So training them to narrate back to you what they've written, and then writing it under the visualizer or writing it on the whiteboard, so that then and literally saying to them, what's the first thing you've written, what's the next thing you've written, is that on the same line or is that on the line underneath, things like that, so that by the time you've finished, you can then say to the kid, right, is this what you can see? Right, if this is what you can see, here is where your issue is. Here is where your error is. You should have, think about solving equation or something like that. You've subtracted 4 there and you should have added 4. Change this to an add 4, rub out the bit that's underneath it, or cross out the bits underneath it, try it again from there, and then let me know when you've finished. And we'll check that you've done it from that point forward. It's those sorts of adaptations that I think were not normal, that we talked about. Or that what we don't want ultimately is kids doing 15 minutes worth of work that we haven't been able to, that normally we'd pick up on it, circulating around the room, and then we're not going to have the opportunity to do that. So we need to be finding alternative ways of checking in with them.
Can I ask 2 questions based off your answer? My first one is that do the teach-do phase, kind of that you mentioned, the extended phase, like often for me that would be done heavily using mini whiteboards. Would it just be the case that they do it because the school's mini whiteboards, they don't have their own mini whiteboards each, so they're not going to be distributed anymore? So it'll be for me, it'll be done in their books, and then it would kind of be like I would work through the answer and they'd have to compare and ask questions and check if it's right. So I don't know, I use mini whiteboards like almost every lesson, so I'm quite apprehensive about using that. So that's kind of my first question is
there not a way you could, because I think mini whiteboards are going to be absolutely vital. And I think I was trying to get the school to get a way of like providing a kid with their own one, even if it's just a laminated bit of card that goes in their book, so they can still have their own.
Yeah.
The other thing with this though, and I think this is where schools have got to wake up a little bit, and in particular departments have got to wake up a little bit, because everybody's thinking, well, I haven't got enough whiteboards in my department to put them in all the places I would want to put them. And then history are thinking the same thing, and they've got some as well. And other subjects have got them and thinking the same thing. And actually, if the school woke up and said, well, we've got all of these mini whiteboards, so let's just put them in the places that we need them. And it doesn't matter if it's a history whiteboard or if it's a maths whiteboard. We'll sort that out afterwards. Let's put them in the places that we need them. Because, with the guidance around shared equipment now, if it's staying in bubble, that's okay. So like we use Cuisenaire rods, and we've taken a load of our Cuisenaire rods and we put them in our year 7 bubble. That's how we're teaching. We're teaching in zones. Our school is big enough that we can teach in zones and keep them there, and staff can move to them. So we've taken a load of our Cuisenaire rods and we put them in the year 7 zone. And it doesn't really matter which year 7 class are using those. You know, we've pretty much got enough each year 7 class to have their own set. But where some of my maths teachers are teaching 2 year 7 classes, they can move them between 1 year 7 class and another, because that's a year group bubble. Shared equipment has got to be cleaned regularly, and it will be. You know, it'll be cleaned at least once a day as part of the end of the day cleaning routines. But it's only when it's going across bubbles that it's got to be cleaned between or left for 48 hours. So things like mini whiteboards, what I would be saying to my school is, and you know, it'd be easier for me in my position, Ashton, than perhaps for you, but you know, I'd be talking to my head of department saying, you know, which other departments have got whiteboards? Can we arrange something here where we put a load of these we'll use our whiteboards to staff the 9, 10 and 11 if we've got enough classes, get science to use theirs to staff the 7 and 8 classes, and then both maths and science can use them, assuming that your school's set up to be able to do that sort of thing. You know, it depends on how your school's coping with the whole bubbles and all the rest of it, I suppose. But you know, we've got to stop thinking about department areas, department resources. These are now school resources. You know, I've had the head of history come in. Can I come and put 80 textbooks in your knuckle room? It's not my knuckle room anymore. You're teaching year 10 on this corridor. You need it there. You stick it there. You know, there's nothing else for it at this point. I mean, don't get me wrong. If I get my department area back, you better come and collect some sharpish. But
okay. That's something I'll look into. And then if not, I guess the point is on narration that you mentioned. And this is kind of more of a question for Atul, really. You know, that's something you're probably quite used to, getting students to narrate their work in. So any tips for it?
Atul won't be doing that. He'll just get them to hold it up to the camera.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
So I was going to say that as well, actually. When I started teaching online first, 8 years, there was no like online whiteboards and any of that stuff. And within a week, I realized it's actually much better if I ask them to articulate what they're doing, because the very process of that pupil articulation means they really have to like think about what they're doing. And in their moments of solve 2x plus 1 equals 5, for example, well, what did you do first? Nothing. That's feedback. So then you know actually they don't know where to start. Or I subtracted 1 from both sides, then you know that's what they've done. But because you know what to expect them to say, because you've got that knowledge, expert knowledge, so you've got to prize out from them. You've got to get them to articulate. And even saying I don't know what you said at all, that is in itself really valuable feedback. And also some of my people's tutees do actually have real mini whiteboards, so they'll stick it up to the camera and I can see it. But I actually, on purpose, I don't get them to do that for quite a while. I really do want them to articulate, because I want them to think about it and then commit to an answer. And that gives me feedback as to exactly where they're stuck. It also gives them the opportunity to like really, really think about what they're doing. So that's a pedagogical tweak you can make with, and it doesn't have to be mini whiteboard. I've also got used to the fact that they can just write in like really big handwriting. So, you know, they can write big handwriting and then show it to me. So they can just use the exercise books that they already have. Just use whatever they have. Sometimes an actual A4 piece of paper with a thicker felt tip pen or a pencil or something. But you have to adapt. You have to see what they have. And it may be that, it just depends. You may have access to mini whiteboards, or you might not, but they'll always have the exercise books. And as much as I like the kind of technology of online teaching and many real digital whiteboards and interacting and stuff, I actually get my pupils mostly to write on pen and paper and articulate or just show it to me using the very exercise book they have that they use at school, or the homework version of it, because that's what they'll be doing eventually. You have to write like your assessment eventually at your GCSE exam, or is written. So that's my kind of one of the ideas I have anyway from having done this stuff. I don't know if it'll work. Whatever you have to do, but certainly from my experience, it works very well.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're in that teach-do phase, as Mark calls it, and you're using things like example problem pairs and things like that, it's not actually a massive issue at that point if only half your class. If you've done an example and then you've asked the class to work on a similar example, and then you say to them, and you put the model solution up or whatever else, or you then go through and model it, and then you say to a class, right, how many people managed to get to there? Or if you're doing the backwards fading, how many people managed to put that last line in? And if only half your class says yes, fine, not a problem, because I'm just going to put another one up anyway. I can just do the same thing, and this time you've seen that, maybe highlighted a little bit about why that was that. Okay, now try it again, and the point is you keep doing that until you're seeing 95% of people saying confidently, yes, this is where I am. Or if you're using a confidence scale on your fingers, I'm now at 5 confidence. When 95% of your class are at 5 confidence, now you can say, right, well, it's good. There's a reasonable chance here that if I give you an independent worksheet, or if I give you a set of independent questions, that you're going to be successful with that. And at that point, then, again, like I said, checking every 2 or every 3 just to make sure you were on the money with that sort of assessment. So in answer to Dawn's question, that's certainly the sort of things that we've talked about in terms of changing routine.
I think actually the work that we've been doing on teaching for mastery and this sort of ping pong style lessons do lend itself very well. And I think I'm quite glad that we were already talking about that sort of thing, and I'm trying to steer the department that way in the last year, because I think had this happened sort of 2 years ago, it maybe would have been a bit more difficult and a bit more of a shock, because I think teachers were much more likely to say, okay, here's an example, here's a worksheet, you got half an hour, and then sort of let them go, which of course is extremely difficult to do if you can't go near kids to help them. I think that sort of ping pong style of teaching does lend itself much better to the situation we found ourselves in.
Yeah, 100%.
Sounds good. Yeah, amongst the many things we talked about, we can go in many directions, but I heard multiple representations. But since both you and both Pete and Ashton, you here attended your Maths Conf 22 or 21 talk, and it was where you use those grids, which is, I think you've got it even on your website, the more than, or less than, or the same.
More, same, less. Yeah.
More, same, less. I mean, just putting it out there. I mean, something like that would work, or how would you use that? Or maybe you can even explain it, because not everyone's been to that talk or familiar with that idea.
Go on, Ashton, you can take that one.
You can screen share if it's easier. You can screen share yours, or I can screen share your site.
I reckon. One sec, let me get it. In terms of just how to use it in general, or considerations for lockdown.
Let's go with in general, because not a lot of people would have attended that talk, or although it's on Twitter, we're probably not aware of it.
Yeah. What do you mean not a lot of people will be aware of it? We've got everybody's aware of it. Doing us dirty here, Atul, I tell you.
Let's go for the remaining people who are not aware of it. whatever proportion you want to
let me find one. I don't know. One sec. Give me a minute.
Yeah, sure. No.
You can discuss another question. Yeah.
While Ashton's finding one, what I would say is absolutely, things. The fact that we're in this situation does not stop kids needing opportunities to think mathematically, to reason, to conjecture, to try things and correct and adapt and stuff like that. It will feel very safe to be able to do some example problem pairs and things like that, and get kids to the point where they can follow a process, and then give them 20 questions exactly like what you've done, and then be able to check every 2 or 3 that they're doing the right thing, and hey, they are all doing the right thing, and then they got to the end of the 20. That will feel really safe. That will feel like that's a job well done. But for me, we're not going to be, that's not what mathematics is about. It's part of it, but it's not what mathematics is about. They are going to have they are going to need these opportunities to develop their thinking, to be pushed into thinking differently. And so there is definitely a place for more same, less grids with that. Once Ashton's got an example of one up, and
I've got one here. Yeah,
excellent, as part of that diet.
Can you see that on the screen?
Yeah, very clear.
So yeah, this is just one with sharing in a ratio, and there is a lot on our website.
Don't show this to any English teachers, though, will you? My life.
Why? What's going on?
You've got a name in there that's not capitalised.
Where's this?
To the top.
Oh, all right. Well, that's getting changed now. There we are. No one saw that.
Live feedback.
So there's a question in the middle. So Tom and Sally share £60 in the ratio of 4-6. To be honest, that shouldn't be a capital there. Now we're being pedantic. I was trying to split it up so it was very clear, each of the parts of the question, but I guess okay. So Tom and Sally share £60 in the ratio of 4-6. How much do they each get?
Could be a full stop at the end of the second one as well.
Yeah, okay.
We're just going to turn this into a grammar and punctuation and spelling critique of Ashton's work.
So, it's quite a standard sharing in a ratio question, and so you'd work out how much they each get here. Now, at the top, it's the number of parts that Tom gets, so less, same, or more. So here, Tom gets 4 parts. So in this box, Tom would have to get more than 4 parts. The amount that Sally gets is the same. So in this box, Sally must get the same amount she gets here. So students have to generate a question such that it satisfies those 2 conditions, that Sally gets the same amount and Tom gets more parts. And there's a couple of different ways you can manipulate the money or the number of parts to make that work. And kind of the key point is that we're trying to change as little as possible from the original question. So students are generating questions themselves, changing a little bit and seeing how that change would affect their answer. And there can be some kind of trial and error element to it as well. They don't have to mathematically work backwards and because it's not easy. It's fine for them to have a few goes and to try different numbers and to play around, because that's all good practice. And while they're doing that, they are explicitly paying attention to what is changing, what is staying the same, how changing something affects the answers. So it kind of combines variation theory with student-generated examples, which I think can be quite powerful to get them thinking mathematically.
And actually, the trial and improvement in something like that, I mean, there are different ones with these. It's not always a question. Sometimes it's just like a surd, and they've got to generate other surds, or, an image, and they've got to some counters for probability, say, something like that. But actually, the trial and error part of that for a question like that is really nice, because a kid changes something and they think that's the effect it's going to have, and then suddenly it doesn't. It's like, oh, well, why didn't that happen the way I wanted to have? And it talks about, Debs and I were talking before the camera started about Craig's new book, Reflect, Expect. What do you expect? And kids will come to that with an expectation that if I change this will happen. And it's natural to form expectations like that, particularly after you've done a couple of trial and improvement, goes at it. It's natural to form that expectation, and then it's sort of like, oh, but it didn't happen the way I expect. Why was that? And so for me, there's definitely a part for those to play in, in a bubbled scenario and things like that. What I would say is, again, similar to what I said before. And actually, when we talked about this, when Ashton, myself, and Jean, who's our other collaborator on that website, talked about this, we talked about, you know, ways of adapting it for kids who might be less confident, as being things like just getting them to fill in one box and then checking on that, or giving them some possible solutions to the other boxes and getting them to decide which box it went into. So you know it goes somewhere, which one does it go into? And being able to have the discussion around that. And all of those things, you know, are still good ways of letting kids off the leash, if you would, without going a long time with them possibly heading down the wrong, you know, heading off in the wrong direction. So I reckon there's definitely a place for those. There's definitely a place for things like the open middle stuff, and the enriched stuff. All of that stuff is still going to be really, really valuable and really, really useful in this situation. But we've got to adapt to make sure that, you know, we can get a sense of how kids are approaching those and what kids are taking away from those, where we might not be able to have those individual one-on-one discussions.
Yeah, it's really, really neat, actually. And it's got that element of thinking mathematically, because they've changed one thing and then they think something will happen, so they form a conjecture and then they test it out, and it may or may not happen. And actually that's really, you know, that's thinking mathematically, isn't it? It's not
absolutely
if people do want to learn more about that, obviously they can check out our website, which is moresamless.co.uk maybe. And also, Tom, we did a video with Tom Manners, which is on YouTube, where we talk about it for about an hour, and we give some kind of recommendations on how to get started with it, and just go into kind of more of the reasons behind why we think it's important for pupils to do, etc.
I think I haven't seen it very much before, actually, so that's been really interesting to hear about it. But I think that's really what I want to try to increase in my teaching in my department as well, because I think that I really got on board with teaching for mastery and looking at changing one thing and variation and all that sort of stuff, but previously felt like I needed to get my students thinking mathematically and doing these more open-ended tasks, but all I knew was from the old days of investigations and you know, those sort of setting up and discovery and all the stuff that you think, oh my God, I just don't want to go there because it just never works the way you want it to.
Breaking out the old GCSE coursework task, yeah.
And it's been nice, you know, open middle, of course, was one of the things that I discovered a couple of years ago, but seeing things like that, I think, has made a real difference, where it does get them to think really carefully about what they're doing, but still keep it within the confines of what you're trying to teach them and what you're trying to get them to learn and understand, rather than just setting this massively wide thing that you end up having to guide them through, or they just get completely lost. So it looks really useful.
Fantastic. We've got another question from Mark McCourt. Suppose
yes, I've seen this one. You know why Mark's asking it? Because he knows what the answer is already. He's just baiting us now.
Well, let's go for it. Suppose you encounter a pupil any age who has a poor grasp of place value. What would you do?
Who's going first?
You can go first, Pete, and I'll piggyback on your answer.
I'm aware I come in first quite often, actually. I thought maybe somebody else would like the opportunity to come in first. I mean, go on, Debs.
Oh, I'm not going to answer particularly, but I was just going to say something that I found really interesting is my own kids, they just finished year 3 and year 5. And I think my teaching of secondary has massively improved having seen them come through primary, and that has really made me realise how much I, as a secondary teacher, need to know about primary and about primary maths and about how young kids understand things, because of course at secondary we get kids who don't understand those things, and it's been really interesting seeing what they get and what they don't get and trying to help them and trying to explain them in things in different ways. So I'm not sure I have the answer, but you know, it certainly needs addressing. And I think it's so important that we go back and look at primary.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a lot we could, you know, with kids in that situation, there's definitely a lot we could learn from primary colleagues with that. And that would be one of the ports of call for, you know, what do you do with a kid who doesn't do this? I mean, for me, there's several, you've got to take them back to the point where they're confident, but the point where they're confident could be, actually, do you get what numbers are?
Mm.
You know, I see a lot of kids who struggles with large numbers come from the fact that actually they have no real concept of numbers, of what these symbols actually mean. They've been taught to manipulate them in an abstract sort of way, but actually they've got no concept of what this symbol means. So this pairing of a 1 and a 0, they don't see as a number. They certainly don't see it as 1 more than 9 and 1 less than 11 and things of that nature. It's just these two two symbols that appear next to each other that means this thing called 10. So, you know, you've got to be prepared to sort of really dig down and go back, all the way back to, if needs be, building up their concept of what a number is, you know, and giving them good physical. And again, you know, I'm gonna toot the horn here completely for manipulatives, but that's my bag. But giving them good physical, concrete ways of thinking about what numbers are, and then building on that to what, you know, think tens are, and things that bridge those tens gaps, those where you're starting to use multiple columns to denote value and size and all of the rest of that. You'd be bringing in your Dean's blocks at that point for base 10. And
it's been interesting to see my boys using what they call jottings from primary, where they have they have the ones and they have the dots, and then the tens become lines, and then hundreds become squares. And when they first do their adding and subtracting using jottings, using just that really simple way of writing down ones and tens and hundreds, unless I see my own children do it, I don't think I would have necessarily known that as a secondary teacher. But
that's a great, you know, that the point about that is it's a really, in that case, it's a visual and written, but it's a really concrete visual. Well, I shouldn't use concrete there, but it is concrete in the way, as a way of making sense of numbers and what numbers are and what the relationship looks like between something with size 1 and something with size 10 and something with size 100, and how they build from each other. So, you know, that's a perfect example of, actually, with a good understanding of how I can make sense of numbers, what numbers are, I can build up to those larger numbers without having to change my view of what numbers are. You know, and that's the problem. I mean, I say it's not the problem. It's it's one problem. You know, when kids learn to add 3 and 5 and do it on fingers or whatever else, and then suddenly they're adding 347 and 572, and it looks nothing like what they were doing before. And that comes back to the point that I made from earlier about how do we make these links explicit? How do you see that when you add 372 and 594, that's what's actually happening with the numbers is no different than when you learn to add 3 and 5. What's actually physically happening with the numbers is no different. It's just the numbers are bigger, so we're having to draw on this issue of place value alongside this issue of addition or whatever else. So, yeah, you know, for me, in answer to Mark's question, right back to, does this kid understand what numbers are? Yes, great, move on. No, fine, let's deal with that. Okay, does this kid understand how columns build from one to the other? Get some Deans out, work with those. If yes, great. If no, you know, if it's then decimal place value, because Mark just says place value, he doesn't necessarily say whole number place value. So if it's decimal place value, does this kid get the idea of unit, the idea of 1, and breaking 1 into parts, into tenths and things like that? Let's play with that for a bit. Going from there.
Just on that, I kind of interpreted the question slightly differently, and I agree with everything that you've said. But the reason why I kind of dodged the question is because it was something that I'm actually quite bad at. Is say for instance, during a year 10 class, you're teaching, I don't know, you're teaching something not really to do with place value, and you find that out in that situation, whatever you're teaching, I don't know, say Pythagoras, just for instance, and in that situation, there's maybe you're doing a bit of a recall, and it's evident that one kid has absolutely no understanding of place value. You've just took over that class. Then what I'm maybe not good at is when to find, I guess, the time to do all that you talked about. Like, one kid in a class of like 30 doesn't understand this, and it's obviously a very important part of maths, and what I struggle with is how can I provide the time to get that kid to understand it and do everything else and with the others. And that's, I've never, I don't know, I consistently struggle at that, and that's kind of what I read the question as. And I guess I'd just like to know, how do you do that kind of intervention for one pupil? How do you logistically manage it?
I suspect to know what Mark would say, and Mark would probably say, and Mark, I'm sorry if I'm misreading you there, but Mark would probably say the kid's in the wrong class, to be fair. Yeah. And there's a strong argument for that. If you've got 29 kids that really do get place value, and I mean really do get place value, and one kid that doesn't, then that kid needs different maths to the rest. So what's that kid doing in with the others? On a practical level, of course, because that's, unless you are in a position in the department to make those decisions and be that flexible in a practical situation, I mean, there's
and just on that, like, for instance, for me, I'm in a really small school where we have 3 classes in each year group. So in that, like, say for instance, in a top set, we'd have like maybe a range of 9 to 5. In a bottom set, we'd maybe have a range of like 4 to even no grade, and that's huge for me. And that kind of stuff comes up all the time, like kids that like lower down the school, kids that can't number bond, for instance, and they're meant to be learning index laws, and I'm like, God, how do I keep those kids that could potentially get a 4, like doing what they should be doing, and intervene with those kids that need that more basic stuff. So sorry I interrupted, but I just wanted to add that to the mix there.
And it's a fair point, because obviously practically there aren't not every department, for whatever reasons, can be that flexible with groupings and has that understanding of kids' strengths and weaknesses to be able to homogenize those groups. And some people, of course, will say, well, you shouldn't be doing that anyway. You should be finding ways of teaching it. I mean, again, there's going to come a point, one would hope, where they need to understand something about place value, because it's going to be coming up into, it's going to be a prerequisite for a topic they're doing. And so the only way, assuming we're taking out, the after school time, which people are not going to be able to use now as much, and specialist intervention. I'm very lucky in my school. We have an intervention tutor that comes in 3 days a week and sort of pulls kids out of other subjects and helps with those sorts of things. But again, this idea of maths art concepts being extensible. So what I might be doing with that is, if I've got a kid who's struggling with place value and that's affecting their ability to work with large numbers, is be doing some work with that kid while the others are working in different bases, which is not directly relevant to their GCSE, but there's always going to be that tension between coverage for GCSE exam versus what kids actually need and can be usefully doing at a particular point. And everybody's got to find that balance, and some people will come more on one side of that balance than the other. But there are other ways that kids can be working on the concept of place value and making new meaning from it and extending their understanding of it, that can allow you the space and time to work with those kids in more basic parts of that idea if you need to. But it's not easy, mate.
No.
It really is.
No.
It's probably one of the toughest things to be doing, particularly when you don't want to be going down the road of, I can have 30 kids doing 30 different things, and my job is to basically firefight around all of them. Because that's physically impossible in this situation, and it's bloody hard, even if it wasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have, obviously, the thing I do is one-on-one, and it's an intervention. I have the luxury of that one-on-one time. But I think maybe what Mark might also be alluding to is the idea of just teaching numbers, digits, and numerals, three very different ideas that when you connect them, you can get up with this place value thing. And once I found that from his podcast with Craig Barton a little while ago, I couldn't stop wondering about it, and I actually teach it to almost every new pupil I start with, irrespective of where they are. Actually, that can also be like A-level, GCSE.
Ash?
It's just numbers, digits, and numerals. And I know I've got an adult, a 60-year-old adult, and they want help with, like, they initially came to me, I wanted help with percentages and kind of functional math. But I'm doing numbers, digits, numerals with them as well. And and you can do that with things like exploding dots. So you could, with exploding dots, you can have them in different bases, come up with the code for that number base. And obviously children some of them have got to get used to doing, in computing, for example, they'll see binary, base 2, hexadecimal. So just as an idea, you could use that in a classroom if the logistics permit. You could get other people, as Pete said, working other bases while you look at just base 10. There's no one idea that ever, as Mark said, you can extend it out, right? There's extension work for every single concept.
I like that exploding dots. I think exploding dots is a good idea. It's a nice way to do that and extend it, and to start quite basically and work good.
I did so our school's got a primary as well, and I was doing some during lockdown when year 6 started coming back in. I did some work with year 6, and I did a lesson on exploding dots with them, and it was brilliant. Like the kind of connection going from base 2, and then we did base 3, and then we were like, all right, you're getting awesome at this, we're going to do base 10. And I was saying like the 10-1 machine, and they thought it was going to be so difficult, and then that kind of realization is, oh my god, this is just how normal.
This is our normal number.
This is our normal, yeah. And then to be able to give them the background behind that of, we use base 10. There's other societies that have used different base. They absolutely loved it, and I absolutely loved it. It was like a 2.5 hour lesson, and they were just, everyone was just so into it. And when you get those real buzzes from just teaching, it was definitely great. So I'd definitely recommend people check that out if they haven't.
I must apologise, Atul. I wasn't laughing at you earlier. I was laughing at the domestic going on in Ashton's background.
Yeah, that's fine. That's all part and part. That's Zoom for you, and it's stuff from home. So, but if it is too noisy, you can just mute and on your side anyway. Okay, brilliant. So the other thing I suppose from me to asking Pete is I from your last presentation at the virtual maths conf, I really liked the way you use vectors, and I think in that first part of the presentation you said we don't have to start using vectors until they're actually in the syllabus much later on, nearly year 10, year 11. You can show them really neat ways of using them to represent, if I remember right, fractions. Use them in transformations really, really well as well. So maybe you could talk about one or two uses if you can with the screen share. That's fine. But if you
Yeah.
can't, that's cool.
Oh, with a screenshot as well. Oh, yeah. I'll have to see if I can find something in a minute while you guys are talking. But yeah, I mean, going back, actually links quite nicely with the last sort of thing. Going back to those good ways of making sense of number, and vectors are an absolutely, they are numbers. If you think about the properties of numbers, particularly when you start to involve directed number, negative numbers and things like that. If you think about the properties of numbers and what helps distinguish numbers from each other, numbers have different sizes, and when you start talking about direction, they can point in different directions. The only difference between numbers and vectors is numbers is what we call them when they're in one dimension, when they're just along a line or whatever else. So I'm going to try and find a sort of a presentation or whatever that I've done in the past where I can show you that. But yeah.
While you're doing that, I teach a bit of Key Stage 3 science as well, and I was actually doing some. I've actually just started doing some planning towards like next year, just today, and I was planning a lesson on vectors and scalars for year 7 in forces. So, and it's something that obviously it comes in maths. Like, we don't teach it till much later, but they already kind of have an idea of what a vector is and what a scalar is, and maybe it's worth discussing with the science department at people's schools. What do you teach about? Do you introduce this? When do you introduce this? How can we build links between what you teach and what we teach? And I think that could be really quite useful.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, they do in physics. They do quite early on. They will do scalars and vectors. The difference between velocity and speed, for example, mass and weight. So they'll get used to it.
But actually, then you can turn that around and say, well, they're going to introduce them as science, but if we've introduced them even before they hit them in science, down in year 7 or something, as a way of making sense of numbers, then actually they can feed that through quite nicely in science as well, and science can build on that, and then we can build on science. Starting vectors with 2 dimensions just seems odd to me now, I must admit. It seems a bit weird that the first time you would talk about these things, which run so perfectly parallel to numbers and the properties of numbers, is when you start looking in 2 dimensions. Well, if we can actually see that a 2-dimensional vector is just the next step up from a 1-dimensional number, then actually, all of that holds. And again, if you think about the pictures you draw when you add vectors, subtract vectors, they are the same or very similar to the pictures you might draw on a number line. I draw my number and then I follow on with my next number. I count back from the end of that coming backwards. Anybody that's done vector work at GCSE or A level in 2 or 3 dimensions, those are the sorts of pictures you draw for showing multiplication by a scalar. When you multiply a 2-dimensional vector by a scalar, it gets 3 times longer. Well, what happens when you multiply, or by 3 in that case, it gets 3 times longer. Well, what happens when you multiply a number by 3? Well, of course, it gets 3 times longer on the number line. It's 3 times as far away from 0. This is familiar. This is kid. Assuming you've taken the time to make it familiar, this is familiar to the kids. And then when you start using them in 2 or 3 dimensions, it's just, oh well, okay, this is just exactly the same as what we were always doing with numbers then. So I have found actually the sort of presentation that I used at some point with somebody, and I'm going to try and share it. This one, here we are. Let's see. Have you got that? Yeah, good. That's so great. I mean, this, and I'll share a bit from the MassConf one as well in a minute, but looking at the number 3, here we go, that's a perfectly good representation of the number 3. What that captures certain aspects, and only certain aspects, because all of these representations capture some aspects more than others, but that captures some aspects of the number 3. It captures its size, and you can look at its size relative to the size of other numbers. You can see why 1 is if you were to draw the vector for 1, you can see why 1 is less than 3 because it's a smaller arrow. If you start to bring in negatives there, you can see why something like -4 has a greater magnitude than 3, but is a smaller number because its end point is further down the left of the number line, which, by the way, and we started doing this now as well, that convention of positive being to the right, just a convention, don't feel like you need to hold to that at all. We've started introducing number lines that go to the left or that go up and go down, because again, these are all useful situations for them to be in. But actually, and the sort of conversations we have around this is the number line, you can't, I'm pointing at it, I'm gesturing at it like you can see me, but the numbers on the bottom of the number line can be thought of as the numbers, i.e. the position of them, but can also be thought of as the scale on which you can show that number, in the same way that an axis is the scale on which you can show these different positions and these different coordinates and these different position vectors. Equally, that's 3. Why is that 3? You can imagine the conversations you can have with kids there. Why is that 3? Some kids will tell you that's 8. It's not 8. Why is it 3? Well, it's the same blooming thing. It's the same. And you start to get a sense of what it means to be 3 in this representation there. That's also 3. That's absolutely fine. And then you start coming into addition. Well, there's then 3 add 2. We know this is 3. I'm gesturing at the green arrow now for people that can't see me, which is everybody. But we know this is 3. We know this is 2. There's what 3 add 2 looks like. And when you take that into 2 dimensions, it's an identical picture, except the arrows are diagonal rather than, or not diagonal, because the arrows are sloped. They're straight lines in 2 dimensions rather than in 1 dimension. But it's exactly the same thing. Particularly if you built up the idea of addition with collecting things, collecting counters, kids should already be happy that 3 add 2 is 5. So it's like, okay, well, you got this 3 vector, you got this 2 vector. How do you put them together so that it gives the same answer? Because it's going to have to give the same answer of 5. And you get all of that, beautifully from vector numbers. There's the resultant vector, which is exactly the same as what you get in 2 and 3 dimensions. Subtraction works the same. There's 5 minus 2. Yeah, there's a 5 vector, there's a 2 vector. It's that part whole subtraction. If 3 add 2 is 5, 5 minus 2, the bit left must be 3. And there's the resultant vector, and it's just lovely. You get there's 3 times 2. It's 3 of those. It's 3 times longer, or 2 times 3, or just plain old 6, because it's the stretching of that arrow. You get everything through that. The sharing screen has stopped as the shared window is closed, because the other one I was going to show you then is what Atul alluded to, which was in the most recent one, which was, I'm just going to get it up. Where's it gone? It's that one. There it is, where you can then start using them then in 2 dimensions, and hopefully this share will work. That's the one I want to share. Yeah, share that one. Where you get, and this is, say, if you've watched the maths comp presentation, you'll have seen this, where you can start. I mean, obviously translations is fine, but where you can start using vectors and the properties of vectors to rotate. That. When you're rotating that shape, what you're actually doing, and as mathematicians we understand this, what you're actually doing is rotating the plane. You're rotating the plane around that point. That's what's actually happening from a mathematical point of view. You're not rotating the shape at all. There is a fixed point and the whole plane is rotating around it. So if you draw a useful vector in that plane, you're rotating the vector, and now you can see where the things are supposed to go. And actually you can start to look at the relationships between the original vector and the vector when it's been rotated and stuff like, and all of this from those basic mathematical, basic idea of numbers through to transformations, we would typically, or in a lot of places, we would teach before in mathematics, not in science, as Ashton's alluded to, but in mathematics, we would teach before we've explored the formal idea of what it means to be a vector. And that
I really like the idea of using vectors for transformations. I think it makes so much more sense because it connects it in with what we've already done, rather than transformations being some completely randomly new topic and drawing all these weird rays and all the rest of it. It stops maths being, thousands of unconnected concepts and starts bringing it together, and it's all part of the same thing. I think I'm going to change all our teaching of transformations this year to that style, certainly, because it's so much better than the whole ray method stuff without understanding what you're doing, and it's more.
But it's all predicated on the idea that actually kids are perfectly capable of seeing vectors early. There is no good reason that, like a lot of schemes do, they say it doesn't come up until the GCSE. Vector geometry, and we've got to make the distinction there. Vector geometry, kids, I've been teaching 15 years now. Vector geometry is stuff kids can find hard. I'm not saying you need to take year 7 kids all the way up to vector geometry. Vector geometry is the eventual outcome for that, perhaps in year 10 or year 11. But it's made so much easier when you've got a good concept of a vector. You've used vectors in places that are appropriate to use vectors, like to make sense of numbers, to support with transformations within the plane and things like that. There's no good reason why they can't get to those sorts of concepts, multiplication of a vector by a scalar, those sorts of things. They're on the foundation GCSE now, multiplication of vector by a scalar. They are recognised as a foundational skill, as something that every math student should see. So if it's something that every math student should see, let's actually bring it down and make use of it where it can be useful, rather than leaving it till year 10 and sticking it as a bolt onto your transformations topic.
Yeah, it's fantastic. When I saw that presentation, I started using, I already thought about like the vector form of the equation of a line, which you see at A level. But when you look at gradients, it's so much clearer and more explicit what the gradient is. So I even just call it a 3-1, a 6-2. A 6-2 goes down to 3-1, and I start doing that in earlier years when you just do it in key stage 3, y equals mx plus c. Well, m is really, if you look at the vector form, it's that transformation 3-1, 6-2, etc. And then when you look at perpendicular ones, which is where I got the idea from, when you just transform it, right? It's just a transformation. So instead of 3-1, it's the other way around. It's negative 1-3, and that's all it is. That's they're often asked the question, why is it flipped around like that? What is negative reciprocal and what is all that? But it is so clear and explicit using the vectors. Yeah.
But I mean, even with stuff like that, I mean, we do perpendicular, not the sort of a formal relationship between the gradients, but a sort of informal looking at what it means and drawing that out right down in year 7. Because I mean, I'm sure we all know kids that when you give them a skewed square, and by that I mean a square that doesn't have perfect horizontal and vertical lines, they'll tell you it's not a square. Well, if a kid's saying that's not a square, then what that means is they don't really understand what it means to be perpendicular. And the concept of perpendicular is not a hard one to really get at. It goes, and again, comes back to what we were talking about before. It goes a long way. It's extendable right into the algebra and all the rest of it. But the concept of being able to look at 2 lines on a square grid and being able to tell they're perpendicular, or being able to look at 2 lines on a plane, on a non-square grid, or a plane, like a piece of plain A4 paper, and measure them with a protractor, that is not a particularly tough concept to grasp. I show year 7 kids lines and ask them whether they meet at right angles, and you do some work with them with that, and they can tell you whether 2 lines meet at right angles, and they're starting to informally get the idea of, because that goes 3 along and 1 up, but that goes 1 along and 3 down. I'm drawing it on the wall next to me, and again, you can't see it, but because that goes like that, this number of squares, and this goes like this number of squares, they get, they can see that that's the sort of relationship that needs to happen for perpendicularity to happen. And then when you eventually get to the idea of perpendicular gradients of lines, well, that's nothing new. We already knew that that's what made things perpendicular. We knew that before we used to do what squares were.
I think, again, you're talking about being really explicit with those small things that I think is it's so important. And, I think we have not been explicit enough as teachers for a long, long time. And the kids who grasp things quickly have managed to cope because they can sort of see it and you go, oh, look, and they go, oh, yeah, I can grasp that. But the ones who don't get it quickly, it's the middle ones. I think they're the ones who we've been failing before we really started to think about being explicit with those sorts of relationships and explicitly teaching it, because they're the ones who don't see those connections unless we point them out. And and then when they come to do their gradients and all the rest of it later on in GCSE, they can't make the connections because they haven't explicitly worked out those connections themselves. And that's, I think, what I always come back to when talking about changing pedagogy and why do we need to include something like perpendicular at year 7. It's because those middle-y kids, if you like, they need, with that little bit of extra support, they can go so much further and they're not going to see it necessarily on their own.
I think also what from that kind of discussion there, what I think is also worth thinking about is that, so something that kids often struggle with for the first time, say something like trigonometry, and it's because being like perpendicular gradient and finding all that kind of stuff, it's because I feel that if you kind of plant the seeds earlier down, and they don't necessarily need to understand everything, but like in year 7, introducing them to this kind of stuff, it gives them time to consolidate it in the mind and almost kind of the maturation phase. Like you could explicitly teach it in year 10 just before you do it, but maybe that's not as effective. Maybe they need to have done that earlier. And that kind of is almost an argument against having like really long units in some ways. But for instance, if you introduce the unit circle and just when you're doing coordinates and you didn't really do anything else other than find the coordinates with a given angle, then in 2 years' time, when they're doing trigonometry, they've already got that in their long-term memory, what sine, cosine, what they are, and they might just be a bit more accepting of it. And then you can link it more effectively using similar triangles, blah blah blah. But I think there's something important there about getting the ideas earlier on and giving them time to mature.
It is. It's that, and actually, that's why one of the reasons why the refocus on curriculum has been so nice, because what we're talking about here is a connected, coherent curriculum. And Ashton, you're on the secondary mastery specialist program at the minute. Debs and I have both been through that program and working as secondary mastery leads. And one of the 5 big ideas there from there is that idea of coherence.
Yeah.
The idea of, and some people think that's. You just need to worry about coherence within the unit, but it's not about that. It's about coherence of that idea. What is this mathematical idea? How do I teach it in a way that it is coherent when that idea is what I'm working on? Where this small part of that idea is then recognizable in this thing that I do 6 months later, is then recognizable in this thing that I then do 2 weeks later, is then recognizable. And you can see how that idea is building in a coherent way, because you understand, to get to the point where I can find the equation of a perpendicular bisector of a line given in the form ax plus by plus c equals 0, I first of all need to have understood what it means to be perpendicular. I need to have understood what the relationship is between the vertical and horizontal the ratio, in particular, the vertical and the horizontal, 4 lines that are perpendicular. I need to understand the idea of gradient as a measure of steepness using that ratio. I need to have understood and blah, blah, blah. And you know that journey, that kid's got to go on with that idea. So where can you put these things in so that they are going to be able to utilize them effectively, allowing for, as you said, Ashton, that maturation period where actually, if I learn about this thing here, I'm probably not going to be ready to develop it to this point for 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever it's going to be. Which I think, although the 2-year figure is sort of the one that's research supported, I think will depend a little bit on how small the step is from one bit to the next, and how far you're pushing that idea. I think you could probably do it sooner with sermon for others, but I think 2 years is your sort of safe bet. I mean, have we done that one, have we?
Yeah, no, that's just profoundly absorbing that idea. Yeah, no, it's kind of brings us back to the very beginning. The very first question I had was, unless they see those interconnections, they've had that time to mature, they will come with that, why are we doing this kind of thing, or when will I use this in real life? But given them the time to connect the dots with the vectors, see that's the same thing they do in physics, and it's just a number line in 2 dimensions, and they can make their own meaning for whatever experience they're having in life, with whatever other topics and subjects and hobbies or whatever their life experiences at the time, and they can I was just kind of absorbing that and bringing it all the way back to the very beginning.
You've taken a whole discussion full circle, Atul. Nicely done.
Yeah, that's what I like about these Maths Chat lives. Like everything starts interconnecting, because teaching is complex, multifaceted. There's so many things we have to do, you have to think about. It's like multi-dimensional. But yeah, that kind of sort of the questions are kind of dying out, so it sort of brings us towards the end. I know, Pete, you've got a book, and I'd be happy to hold it up and for you to plug it, because I do have a copy. I know that vector representation is really, I mean, when I read it and I started looking at it, I use it on my canvas or online on bit paper. You have the arrow thing, but you can do loads with it. So maybe you can just mention, I've got a copy here, so you can. I'm the one holding it this time, not you and the whole thing. So, and Ashton as well. From yours, if you can put it on Twitter, the more or less than website, any presentations. We'll just put that on. We'll plug it for you. And
I'm feeling like I ought to have something to plug, but I'm just struggling to just even get through dealing with my kids and my job at the moment. So
you can plug the NCTM and doing the mastery bit.
I've done some sewing and some crocheting and some running and drawing and things, but
it's all good.
NCTM Mastery is a great. The Teaching for Mastery program is worth getting involved with through your maths hub, definitely.
Yeah, particularly if you're interested in these sorts of ideas and things like that. There's no better place to start the journey on those, I don't think.
Yeah, and maybe I should say about research schools as well. I mean, one of the things I'm going to do down in Sussex is the training course next year on the EEF guidelines for Key Stage 2 and 3, which is a really nice overlap of looking at the research school stuff, but also how it links to Teaching for Mastery and all those sorts of ideas, which is really why I wanted to become involved in the research school, because I do think those things link up very well. So there's lots of good stuff out there to look at.
Fantastic. So once again, thanks for your time. I know you are already starting at school or about to start, and it's a really busy, intense time with what you're about to do at school and with family and things. So I really appreciate taking the time and sharing your knowledge. The recording will be there anyway, so people can review it or look at it again, rewind and rewatch. Brilliant. So I'm going to stop streaming, and then we'll just have a quick debrief, and we can finish up there. Thanks again for everyone who's tuned in and for your time again.
Matey, thanks for having us.
Yes.
Thank you.